Thanks everybody for joining us. This is great. Look at the big group we have. Wow. Um, Today we're going to have Barry Vogel talk about um, how to do a talk show, how to ask good questions. He has a nice, unique perspective to do this because he has a background of being an attorney, and that has influenced and informed his interview style. And he also, his show Radio Curious, which has been a long time show on Audioport, also has most of its episodes on the Library of Congress. So that's also a unique thing about Barry. I think that's all. Oh, and if anyone has time, there's also bonus content. When we're done talking today, Barry has told me that he is willing to give a tour of his yurt. He's actually broadcasting, he's calling from a yurt today, and I thought that was particularly fun. So I'm going to stay for that if anyone else wants to. So with that, I'm going to turn over the microphone to Barry Vogel. Thank you.
Well, it's really nice to be here, and I apologize for the whatever the electronics were that I don't understand.
Can you hear us, Barry?
Yes,
Okay.
Well, I hear an echo, and I can hear you.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure how to handle that, but I've called this in conversation with Stephanie, the art of asking questions and listening to the answers. And I'm going to read most of it that way. I'll get everything I put down. And if it's okay with you, I'm going to set the my phone down. When I was young, little kid, I was told by a lot of people that I'm very curious, and I thought everyone was. I didn't know that I was different. Some people said, "Why are you asking these questions?" And I said, "Because I'm curious." A bit of my background. My parents frequently talked about social change and politics and ideas, which really intrigued me. From being a little kid, going to high school, going to college, being in the Peace Corps in Peru, going to law school, it was pretty clear to me that practicing law was the best or the safest tool to foment social change. I opened my law practice here in Mendocino County, which is about 110 miles north of the Golden Gate Bridge, in 1974. In the mid-'80s, I was involved in developing KZYX and eventually getting it on the air in 1991. It's the local public radio station here. And the general manager suggested I do a program. I asked about what? He said, anything you want. I couldn't turn that down. Being curious, I wanted to ask questions, and I called the name of the program Government, Politics, and Ideas, which many people said, thud, 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 you ought to change it, which was what Terry Gross said when I interviewed her in 1994. So I picked a better name, and it became Radio Curious. If in this discussion, any of you have questions, you're welcome to raise your hand when you think it's appropriate. So my goal for today is to share a bit of what I've learned in the 28 years of having produced and been the host of Radio Curious. So my goal today is to share that. Before you interview someone, this is you, I suggest that you determine what your goal is in doing the interview. I can share with you my goals, which is one, and some of these are obvious, I hope. Be sure the guest feels comfortable and respected. I tell every guest at the beginning of the interview that if I ask you something that's too personal, tell me and we'll move on. If you don't want to answer it, don't. And then I tell them, if you feel or realize that your answer to the question could have been said differently, tell me, and we'll start it again, and I'll edit out the part that the guest doesn't particularly like. What I found at the end of the interview, the guest says they really appreciate an interview with someone who's read their book. That's part of the goal. The other goal is something I learned from Ursula. When a listener tells me they stayed to listen to the interview and were late to wherever they they were going, I'm really pleased. And Ursula pointed out that that's a driveway moment. I confirmed that from her a couple of days ago. So be prepared. And I'll discuss how I prepare shortly. But if after 5 minutes I realize the conversation is going nowhere, I ask my guest the last 3 questions that I'll share with you again in a moment. Sometimes I've done that. And then they say, can you ask me about something? And, we do, and it works out. Other times it doesn't. I do not prepare the introduction to the program until after my edit is completed. That means I start recording with the guest when I say, Stephanie, welcome to Radio Curious. And then I say, can we begin by me asking? After that part, when I put the program together, is when I bring in her voice, and I'll explain that a little more specifically. This goes to the editing aspect and the introduction that I play on the air. The introduction identifies the guest, their background, the topic of the interview, and a name of the book which they might be asking. And the interview ends. Not the interview, the introduction ends when I say, Stephanie is in her position. This is a little bit about her background. And we began when I asked her to say, what brought you to radio, for example. So that's my interview after it's edited, and then her voice comes in without further reduction. I fade out the theme music and bring up hers. If you listen to any of the Radio Curious interviews, you'll know what I mean. So when I'm recording the interview, I like to not the interview, the introduction. I like to focus on a few words with a slight change in voice and with pause. And I underline those words so that I can see it's time to be real soft and clear. I find that this might be the case. I'm hearing feedback from my cell phone, but I try and place the microphone, as you can see. Let me just move this up here.
We were talking about your cell phone. I wonder if you muted your cell phone, if that would help.
Well, I could, but I don't know that I can find the
button
place to do that.
Okay.
So I'd rather not.
If you can, yeah, Tala, we got something going working, so we'll just
yeah,
okay.
Right. Theme music, putting the front end together. The theme music is a trademark. It's comes from Durango Saloon that I found I walked into a music store in I think 1992. I heard it playing and Bingo, that was it. So when my equipment, like right now, and again, I don't think you can see it, but I bring my hand about 1 inch from the microphone so I can talk more clearly. And unfortunately, we don't have a full circuit here, so I can't hear you. And I want to interrupt something I didn't write down. The reason why I'm having difficulty with the microphones is that I basically stopped doing interviews about 5 years ago. And now I'm playing the archives, of which there's close to 1,000. And lots of electronic issues have changed, and my skill has waned in that amount of time. If we had done this 5 years ago, I could have arranged my end better. And again, I apologize for that.
Oh, we're all right. We can hear you fine. We're not having any echoes.
Okay, good.
But
good.
we do have a question from Sarah. She asks, are there concerns with copyright when choosing a theme song?
I have permission from the author, or from the person who wrote it, and I have it in my files, and no one has ever barked or said don't do it. And I like his work. I like his music. But I asked first. I just didn't grab it and run with it. Yeah,
and Ursula and I would copy that. If it's a theme song is something you play over and over again, right, every day or every show. So it is something that is copyright protected. And if it's like a famous, song or whatever. So you do either want to have something that's copyright free or have permission. Yeah.
So moving along, I find the place of the microphone the best to talk softly, gently, and clearly as a way of setting a mood. And when I ask questions, create a question, or the goal is to create an image with words. And for example, avoid saying, ask a guest to say, or go back and say it. Avoid saying, I moved from here to there. That may work for television, but it has no image for radio. Say instead, I moved it from the middle of a small, round, blue table across the room, trying not to trip on the rug, and carefully set the whatever it was they were moving down on the far side of a red bench, so that you can see those things, which you don't see if I moved it from here to there, or you do, but maybe it's not the image that's at issue. So Barry,
since the guest will be the one doing most of the talking, is this something that you ask them to consider when they're ask a question?
If they bring up a question, that's a good question, Stephanie. Thank you. If they bring up a question in that manner, or they say something like that in that manner, I'll interrupt them. Or when they're done with it. And I said, could you please phrase it by describing what it looked like, where you picked it up, where you went with it, and where you put it down?
Okay, and thank you.
Then I remind them that I would edit that out when the piece is edited. Avoid leading questions. What was the color of the sky, rather than saying, was the sky blue? Again, it's descriptive and may offer other questions. And avoid compound questions. I listen to the PBS NewsHour most every day, and the interviewers there ask compound questions. The problem with compound questions is that you're giving the guest freedom to ignore one of the questions. Whereas if you're there just asking what you want to know, not giving them a choice, you can dig deeper into that if there's something you want to do.
And you can also, it seems like from shows that I've heard where there's compound questions, it kind of can fluster the guests sometimes, and they don't know which one to answer first.
Yeah. But I would say, looking at all of the call letters on the stations of the where all of you come from, that you're probably pretty familiar or have your own way of getting around these issues. What not to do? Don't include the answer as part of your question. I did that on one of my first interviews early on, and the man who was then the poet laureate at the Library of Congress said, "Barry, you just answered your question." I felt kind of stupid, but he was right. So interview preparation, or the guts of the program. I found that if it's an author I'm interviewing, reading the book makes it too complicated. And also, I was working full time and had a family, and reading the book took more time, harder to prepare, and harder to edit. So what do? I read the introduction, a summary at the end, if or at the beginning if there is one, and the index. For me, that identifies the parts of the book, as well as just thumbing through it, that interest me the most. Reading the entire book, like I said, makes it too complicated and more difficult to focus. So let's make this a little show and tell here for a minute, if I can get it to you. I go to blank pages in the back of the book. Well, these aren't blank. If let me see if I can get a good focus here.
Yep, I can see scribbling on there.
Okay. What those scribblings indicate are the page number where I found something I want to be ready and crisp to ask about, and 10 or so words describing what it is. So in doing that, it brings together to me what the opening question is and what the closing question is. And depending on how the conversation flows, I'm able to ask questions related to it. Or if one answer relates to the question I have in my notes, I remember it and go to that page and put it into a context. So let's see, where are we here?
Can you give an example of that?
Well, yeah. You may be familiar with The Voice of Other Sons. I think this, how do I get it before there? I think this should be mandatory reading in all schools, including Florida. The things I'm looking at here are stories of the forgotten, stories of people who were alive when the person was alive, but they had to be retold by someone later on. And this is particularly true of The Warmth of Other Sons. And may I trust that you're familiar with the Great Migration that went on in the United States in the earlier part of the last century. When there were fewer jobs, this is another part that I wrote down. We were talking about fewer jobs, less tolerance, and more exclusion. Can you give me some examples? Just about Jesse Jones, when he went, I think he was going to an event, but he had to ride the freight elevator. And I wanted a little more elaboration on that. And they basically go on seeking elaboration or connecting to somebody else. The goal in the and developing an edited part of an interview, my goal is 26 and a half minutes of solid content. But remember, in setting that time frame, that's because the first leading up to the opening or the initial question is part of my introduction, spoken over the theme music. So when I've said, we met with Stephanie and we began when I asked her, why radio? Why what you're doing? Then I bring the theme music down and come in directly with her voice, directly answering that question. Sometimes it's difficult, particularly if I've got a lot of content and I've got 30 to maybe 40 minutes, not enough for two interviews, but solid content. And then I just have to listen to it and find out what is of lesser importance and edit it out. I think it's important to not speak. In other words, be quiet when the guest is speaking, even if they say something that is, good or too much or not good, or they're reiterating it. You can always say, edit it. Yesterday, I was listening to a program and the person kept saying that the host kept saying, yes, sure, right. And all that did, from my perspective, is gave the guest an invitation to keep talking. And if you have to interrupt and say, wait a minute, can I ask you something? It's always editable. So the final product sounds smooth. And that's edit. That edit is never known to the listeners. They just hear what is approved.
Yeah.
At the end of each interview, kind of trademark or final questioning that I didn't start right at the beginning. I think I started those probably about maybe 2005. I thank him for the interview and I say, and before we close, I have a couple of questions. And the first one is, can you please tell us about an aha moment or another moment that changed your life? In other words, I want to know about them personally. And the second question, what would you like to do with the remainder of your one precious life? And get ideas of what they might be thinking about.
What makes you decide to do something like that, Barry? I know like podcasts do that too once in a while, where they have just a little thought experiment at the end. What do you think that adds to? Is it kind of add a different layer or?
It adds information and a personal effect, an opening into personal life of the person who you're interviewing. It makes them more real. Interviewing is the strongest magnet of interviewing is listening. If you listen carefully, you can hear a whole lot more. The hardest part for me of doing this interview is listening carefully, thinking quickly where the next follow-up question should be. And that's why I have them in the back of the book that fits into it, because I can remember what I wrote there. And then it has a page number, so I turn the page. It's not like what we're doing now, where we're slightly visible. I don't know how visible I am to you, but it looks to me like I'm talking over to the left. But it allows it to be more personal and more real. Some people ask me those questions. And the last question is there a book that you could recommend to our listeners? Some people say their own. I say, well, is there another one? And edit out that part. Edit out the prompting phrase. So that's pretty much what I my notes for this afternoon. Stephanie mentioned the Library of Congress. I'm really proud that that's where Radio Curious is. But it's a lot easier to find Radio Curious if you go to radiocurious.org, or if you're looking for a special topic. On Google, you could write Radio Curious Pete Seeger or Jimmy Carter, or other programs where I have interviewed people who assume the persona of someone who's dead, like Lincoln, and other well-known people. There's a particular group, I don't know that I have them here, I can't remember the woman's name, regretfully, but she was one of the founding 3 members of the women's rights movement in the 1880s. She died first. She was left out of the group in the usual discussion of it. And her persona is presented by Sally Roche Wagner, who lives and works and does some radio, but teaches in Western New York. So, as I say, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Barry. This was lovely. We've already got some questions rolling in for you.
Sure.
We have one from, I'm sorry I didn't learn your name when we were doing the technical issues, but is it Ahmad or Ahmada? He has a question. How do you introduce a guest you have had on several times over the years, knowing many listeners have heard in the past, but you still have many new listeners?
Well, I think there's two, that raises one issue. Perhaps the person who asked has gone to the Radio Curious website and see the name come up several times. That's because when I replay the archives, as I'm doing now, then it gets posted there again for new listeners. There are some people who I've interviewed 5 or 6 times, one of them being Sam Farr, who was a colleague of mine in the Peace Corps, and then we ended up going to law school together, and he went into politics, and he was a member of Congress. So when issues would come up in Congress, I'd call up Sam and talk to him, and it would be a program. One of the more memorable ones.
When you talk to Sam, would you say, this is Sam, we've had him, we like to talk to him when certain issues come up, and he's here today to talk about X, or?
No, I would weave who that person is, whether it's Sam or anybody else, into the context. We've spoken before on other issues, and this evening we're talking about the sit-in at the well of the House of Representatives when there was a protest, and I called him up. I think it was about midnight or 1 a.m. in Washington, and said, "Sam, can we record?" And he said, "Yeah, sure. Well, what's going on?" And so forth. But I do interview some people several times if they have something that I'm curious about.
So, how do you introduce them is the question.
This is the second time we've spoken.
Mm-hmm.
The first time it was about whatever it was, and the second time is about what we will talk about in that program.
Okay. Awesome. A question from Davine. Can you share bullet points with us? Can you post them on the chat, or maybe you could send them to me and I could share them more?
What do you mean by bullet points? Notes?
Yeah, bullet points of your talk today,
Yeah, I can mail that to you.
Mm-hmm.
I could edit it a little bit, knowing how my abbreviated spelling.
Okay.
or you can read it because it's reasonably clear. I'd say 90% clear.
Okay, well,
I'm
anyone
happy to
who
share it.
would like 90%, anyone who would like a copy, yeah, get in touch with my email and oh, I see Erica, oh, people are giving you their email. Okay, it's already happening.
Good.
Do you see those in the chat, Barry?
Say that again, please.
The emails in the chat, people who want your
Well, I don't know.
it might be, why don't you guys just get in touch with me? I think that will be easier.
Oh yeah, I see the I see them.
Yeah, what everyone just come through me. And I put my email in the chat, stephanie@pacifica.org.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah. Let's see. Where did it go? Oh, here we go. Can you talk about the role of building a story with an interview?
I've never looked at it from that perspective. But what I listen to after I've listened to the interview is that there's a story there. When I go for what I hope is a daily walk of maybe 45 minutes to an hour, I listen to the current issue, the current interviews, which are from the archives. And I listened to something, the name of the interview and what we talked about, I could not have come up with on the list. But it makes sense to me as someone from the point of view of never having heard of it, or heard that interview. But I recognized my voice and I know I did it. And I said, did I ask that question? But I don't specifically try to weave it into a story. I let it come out on its own episode. And just as an aside, when I came to Mendocino County in the mid-70s to settle down and start a law practice and have a family, a lot of us bought maybe 20 acres, 40 acres back in the woods where large areas were being divided. And the county building code said that's against the law. It's a misdemeanor to build a house without a permit, and we won't give you a permit if you build a log cabin. And you have to have running water. You can't have an outhouse. You have to have a flush toilet, which I think was absurd then and a whole lot more absurd now, considering the nature of our water shortage. But a lot of people don't like to talk about toilets, so it doesn't go very far. These people were 135 people were charged with the misdemeanor, which is less of a crime than a felony. The misdemeanor of not having a building permit, which the county would not issue, and number two, using and maintaining an outhouse. So I said, let's try those cases. Let's go to court, see what happens. In picking the jury, otherwise known as voir dire, I asked each juror if they were aware that 6 presidents of the United States had been born in a log cabin. And does this knowledge or lack of it interfere with your ability to fairly judge my client who's on trial for having built a log cabin? And it didn't matter what the answer was. And then I asked them similarly, do you know if your grandma had ever used an outhouse? And we won the first 4 cases, and they dismissed the remaining 131. I got to be, thank you, Erica.
People are clapping.
I got to be known as a lawyer who could win those kinds of cases. And I went to, we had 13 different trials around Northern California. One of them, in every one, I wanted my client to testify, and I wanted pictures. I wanted him to show pictures. And if my client's mother or my client's mother-in-law were there and they had kids, I wanted a picture in front of the house with the family. And I'd ask, who are all of these people? And they say, well, this is my daughter. She's 4 years old. This is my mother-in-law. This is my wife. To show that, they're like the rest of us. They're just building their own house. Some of the cases near the end, after the county presented their argument for a conviction, I would move to dismiss the case. All they said was that there was a house built on this property, the subject property, and there was no testimony that, one, my client owned the property, or two, that my client had any connection with the property. So what if a house was built there? You got to show that the person on trial was present and had an interest or participated in the crime. So the judges dismissed the case before we could put on our trial, and some of them were very angry with the prosecutor, the district attorney, who brought them that far and wasted the court trial. So it was interesting. Gave me something to do when I first settled down here. I mean, there are lots of episodes, and that, for me personally, goes back to the idea that I think that practicing law provides the safest tool to foment social change.
Are there, I remember when we were on the phone together, Barry, that you were saying, that practicing law informed your approach as an interviewer. And I think you said one of those things was don't ask leading questions. Was there any other, can you talk a little bit more about that, or any other things that being an attorney informs you in?
Listening carefully as to what is said and what is not said. And from the point of view of an attorney versus the point of view of, or the perspective of a radio interviewer is, you've hired me to help you on these issues, whether it's a child custody case, whether it's a property division case, whether it's an inheritance situation. There's lots of things that may be relevant in a legal case that are not thought to be relevant by the client. So it's really listening and understanding the breadth of what a case is, and or what a legal situation is, and poking around to see if there's any evidence there. One of the problems of that, in being a lawyer in a small town, by small town, the city of Ukiah is about 16,000. The area is about 30,000. The county, which is the size of Delaware and Rhode Island combined, has about 90,000 people. So there's not a lot of people here. But if you have to know a full and entire perspective of all the laws and all the changing parts, there wouldn't be enough time to breathe. So I narrowed what I did over time. And if it was something that was really important, like stopping the aerial spray of Agent Orange in the redwood forests, which was something we did again in the late 90s, the late 70s, you study up on it, you learn it.
So when you translate that into being a radio host, it's doing your homework, basically, like you said.
It's doing your homework. It's reading the book. I met some people, I think it was at the NFCB conference in San Francisco in the early 2000s, who interviewed authors. And I said, well, what do you ask them? I said, well, tell me about your book. don't you read the book? No, never. To me, that's not how I would feel comfortable doing it.
Wow, that surprises me actually.
Me too, but who's to say? The people who there are to say are the ones who turn it off. The answer that that I can't remember if I said earlier. I have it in my notes. Let me see if I can grab it here. I learned from Ursula. They sat in their car with the waiting to go inside to hear the end of the program. Those are the compliments. The compliment from the guest. I like to be interviewed by somebody who read my book. Those are the compliments that I really appreciate.
Right. Right.
Maybe
And and I thought that was cool that, well, I mean, you didn't read the whole book, but the parts that you did read, you really studied and paid attention to. So they really felt like you did.
It felt like I did.
Yeah.
And on some of them, I'll go read the whole book. But to do it first, there's too many moving parts for me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, right. The work that you do. Well, and I had asked you, I think, or maybe you just told me, but you said something like the subject that you're interested when you look at the book, you don't just look at that one page, you look in the index and you find the other pages that subject appears on. So if the conversation progresses further, you are well informed.
That's right. And generally, I'll read not the whole book, but I'll read, depending on how big it is, I'll read half to 3/4 of it.
Yeah. Depending on how big the book is or what?
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
Well, like The Warmth of Other Suns is 620 pages. This one,
Yeah, that's big.
The Black Gods of the Asphalt, talks about a man who grew up in a barrio, well, not a barrio, but a segregated area of Boston, and went to Yale on scholarship because he was an outstanding basketball player. But they wouldn't associate, the people there wouldn't associate him, the other basketball players wouldn't associate with him. So he dropped basketball and went into another topic and area of study and came out with a PhD. Another one, I just picked a couple of my favorites here. This is Your Life on Music by Daniel Levitin. And it talks about how our brain perceives music and understands what's going on. Thank you, Clint. And there are a couple of other books like that. And I've got lots and lots of books that I've interviewed, which are separate. They have their own place on the bookshelves, and lots and lots of books that were sent to me with the hope from the publisher that I would do an interview. And if I didn't really connect to it, there was always one that I did connect to.
I see we're approaching 4:00. I want to ask Marshall's question before we're done. Oh, there. He says, my show is broadcast live. Has Barry done live interviews and have any insights?
Yes, I have done live interviews, and they're much easier in terms of time and editing. But the question is, do I want quality? Do I want to ask someone a question that takes me maybe 5 minutes to think of the right question or to get it going or to restate? Sometimes I've interviewed people and they've answered it very indirectly, but they said something that was compelling. So I would, in the editing, I would cut out the question I originally asked and posed it in a way that they responded to specifically from what they said that I wasn't expecting to hear. Does that mean programs should not be done live? No, it does not mean that. If you are comfortable in doing a live interview, it'll come out in your persona, in your question, in your voice. I just did I did pre-recorded interviews for that reason, and I also had some early on. I had difficulties because people would not call at the scheduled time, or they were not at the number that they gave me at the scheduled time. And there I was with 30 minutes to do a program, and I wasn't prepared. And that's when I really shifted. Is that a question, Clint?
Barry, I'm trying to get a sense of what you feel is the operating structure for your interviews. Do you have a sense of a limited number of topics you can cover, or what do you use for structure for your interviews?
You mean the topics that I cover? It's limited to my curiosity. If I'm interested, I want to know more. And the back of I don't know if you can see it, but is that clear?
No. Oh, that's your T-shirt that you were sharing earlier. That says your Radio Curious T-shirt.
The Radio Curious interview, and on the back of it is it says the cure for boredom is curiosity. There is no cure for curiosity.
So do you just trust that your curiosity will give that interview a structure? Is that maybe what you're saying?
Yeah. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. If it does, I've gone into an area that I find to be very fascinating. I was traveling in Ecuador. Before that I mentioned I was in the Peace Corps. That was in Peru, and I had the good fortune of picking up a fluency in Spanish. This was beginning in 1964, and I still have most of it. But I was traveling in in Ecuador with my daughter, and people were talking about various religious ceremonies. And I said, "Can I interview you about that?" And they said, "Sure." Some were done in Spanish, some were done in English. But other issues
Well, I'm curious, because it is interesting to hear Ursula's question, because I know how she does a lot of preparing as well. And she works, well, she calls it building a story to make sure that it doesn't go off on tangents, to keep the focus. And sometimes she has to reorganize the structure, which in that sense, I feel like you guys have in common, because you sound like you're very sensitive to the editing. You both do a significant amount of editing. What am I saying? Is that where do you
Well, it sounds to me, Barry, like what you said in answer to my question was that the structure we're talking about editing here, not the interview itself. Obviously, when you edit, you have to apply some sort of structure to it. And it sounds to me like what you said was that the structure you use is what the person said that you think is really interesting, that you look for the interesting things they said. Is that what you're saying?
Pretty much, but there's a specific, there was a specific case of an interview I did that I was really, really excited about doing. And I listened to it, and it made no sense to me. And I realized that if I took the last question and put it at the beginning, it made perfect sense throughout the whole thing. if you're interested in more details, I know where the book is down the hall. I can get it and we can be specific. But I think if the structure needed to be arranged, one question put in place of or in front of another question, I do that.
Would you characterize that as similar to building a story, Ursula? Is that what you were saying earlier?
I don't know. I'm not sure I understood your answer, Barry, but I think so. I mean, a half hour isn't a real long time, so I'm just wondering how you decide what needs to be included.
That has to do with going back to the notes in this is like a mirror. I don't know if that's clear, but I write the page number and I write the a little bit about here. It's well, I don't know that it matters that I give you examples, but I certainly will if you want. I look through this through the notes that I've made in the back of the book that direct me to the page that is underlined where there's more talking about it to refresh my memory. And I can see where the conversation is going. This looks like it has maybe 20 different pages. I figure if we do 5 or 6, we'll have a solid interview. And I choose them as we go, depending on what the flow of the conversation is. But I do know what the first question would be, and I do know what the last question would be. Well, that sounds contradictory to what I said. I know what the first question would be. I don't know what the last question would be. But that comes together when I've read the book. It gives me a point of departure. Does that help?
Does that help, Ursula?
Does that answer your question?
I think maybe our approaches are so different that our questions aren't quite syncing up. I mean, it sounds, I mean, in my way of thinking, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that the in a way, the goal of your show is to discover a unique viewpoint or unique information that somebody has to offer. And you're looking for that in the interview. Am I understand you correctly?
I think there's 2 parts to what that, my answer would be 2 parts. If I was talking with a specialist or an elected official or someone who's campaigning for office, I would ask specific questions where I know they have the answers. If I found a book like This Is Your Brain on Music, and I wanted to know more about it, I would go through the book, the 2/3 or so that I read, and ask related questions relative to what I read. Ask them to explain certain things. But if you're saying, do I have a list of questions from the beginning to the end? Rarely. I really don't remember doing that. I can't tell if that's answering your question by watching you.
Well, I think you're sharing your process, so it's interesting to hear your process.
What is yours?
Well, I'm thinking more about the editing part of it than the interview itself. You know, I always just look for a story, you know, for what this person has to say that's unique, that other people can, or that, you know, we all can learn from. And I kind of focus the editing around that.
I think that's true for what I do. If I don't find that there's something unique, I don't go on to the edit and I don't broadcast the interview. If it is unique, well, let me say it this way. Things that people have had a book published about have, from my perspective, something that often is unique because they've studied it and they have experience, possibly scholars, and looked at it from many different perspectives. If it's somebody on the street who I end up talking to, the conversation is not with an interview in mind, and it may be over in 3 minutes, or we may become good friends and have a lot more to talk about.
That's interesting, Barry, that, you'll agree to do an interview with someone, but that might not necessarily actually become a broadcast.
That's right. And some people who know me or who hear the program will reach out to me and say, can I be on your show? This is what I want to talk about. And depending on how they present it, I'd say, sure, send me your book. Get me a copy.
Do you tell them that that the interview might not become a show?
At some point I do, yes. And most people, I think of people who have said, here's my book. I'd like to talk. I'd like to be on your show. Is not one that has fruition being an interview. And then there's people who, well, actually, I misspoke. I'll skip that part. So, though maybe not. When my mother was approaching 100, she wrote a book called What's My Secret? And she told her life story. And of course, I interviewed her. She went to medical school in 1930 and was the only woman in her class.
Well, that's good. You didn't cut out your mother
yeah, right.
from the show. Well, yeah, of course.
Looking back on her life, her motto was, if somebody else can do it, so can I. And that was what I just figured it could do. So I did. And some people said, how did you know to do that? And I said, well, I don't know. I just did it.
I know some people have had to go, and if anyone else needs to go, that's fine too, of course. Are there any other questions that anyone has for Barry?
Here's one that you wrote, Stephanie.
Mm-hmm.
How many topics are generally included in a half an hour?
Mm.
It depends on who I'm interviewing. Generally, I stay within the scope of the guest. I don't like to have more than one guest. Sometimes I've had two, and it becomes difficult to get a balance between them.
Yeah, you're trying to kind of get to the heart of the matter. It probably takes a little work to get there sometimes.
Yeah. But if people who had to go or who asked some questions want to call me, I'm happy to chat about it.
Fantastic.
It's not something I ever planned to do. It's something that I did because a friend of mine said, why don't you do a show? I said, what? Yeah, anything you want.
I said, what?
Show about what? He said, my choice. And that's hard to turn down.
That's pretty cool. Did this person have a radio studio for you?
At that time, the studio was just being put together, about a 40-minute drive from where I live. And he said, we'll record it, and that was just at the beginning days of cassette recorders, when editing was a lot more complicated. But we figured out how to do it.
That's awesome. I see. Oh, question from Davine. Yep.
Yes. Do you think just 30 minutes is adequate time, or is it maybe depend upon the person and the topic, or what do you find is ideal?
I think for me, 30 minutes worked. For me to listen and think about what the next question is at the same time is a little more complicated than just listening and asking written questions and not follow-up questions. If I'd say maybe 10, possibly 15% of the interviews are 2-part series. Some are 3-part series. One is probably by now maybe 7 or 8 parts, has to deal with evangelical activity at the Air Force Academy for the United States in Colorado. And there's a man who started an institute, Military Religious Freedom Foundation, about what's going on there. And I have interviews with him over many years. If you're interested in that, go to Radio Curious, type in Google Radio Curious Military, and it'll come in. The man's name,
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say the man's name is Mickey Weinstein or Weinberg, something like that.
Davine's question made me think of one too when you were answering. You said you are listening intently and thinking of the next question. So the way you edit, do you just allow for that space during the interview to let yourself kind of to let yourself just take it in and think of the next question and then edit out that space?
There's rarely a space.
Okay, so it comes to you pretty naturally.
Yes, yeah. Not having been in practice, not having done interviews for 5 or so years, and listening to the archives, I think I could do it now.
Okay.
It's a kind of thing that perhaps was developed when I was practicing law, and I wanted to cross-examine someone in a courtroom. I had to not only listen and understand, but find out where a question might be presented that would show that what was just said, I had another perspective.
Yes, that's another area where being an attorney informs you.
But I think I don't think it has to do with being an attorney. I think it has to do with doing one's homework, knowing what's there, and being able to jump from one thing you hear to a related thing and ask them, are they in contradiction, or how do they fit together?
Well
And
said.
that's where the goal would be. In a courtroom, it would say, well, this seems to contradict what you said previously somewhere. And radio can say, well, how does A and B fit together?
Oh, that's lovely.
Because one radio is, as I see it, is an opportunity to have a serious discussion with someone about where they are knowledgeable and I'm interested. A courtroom situation is my client's right, you're wrong. So it's a different approach, different goal. Goals, I think, are very important. That's why I said at the beginning, when you start out, what is your goal in doing this? Is having a live program the goal because you only have a limited amount of time to do it and you're good at it? Or is your goal having something that is more evergreen and can be done over a period of time and be interesting? Not that a live interview would be uninteresting, but something that's interesting 10 years, 15 years later. I don't mean to disparage live interviews by any means. I think that's a very powerful skill, and it's not something that I think I have as well as one that I can look back on and maybe put the questions and answers in a different sequence than they were asked, which is much easier now with the technology that's available than what was available a long time ago, like 30 years ago.
I see we have one more question from Ahmad. When you get an interview that goes long, do you split it into 2 episodes or just edit it down?
It depends on how long it is. If I've got 30 minutes of high quality content, I'm more likely to edit it down. If I have 50 minutes of high quality content and I see that that's coming up, then I'll draw out more questions so that I get 60. 1 hour gives me 2 26.5-minute interviews with the voice of the guest. That does not include the intro or the outro. The outro is pretty simple. This week we visited with Stephanie Schubert from her office in Ames, Iowa, about whatever it was we've talked about today. That's pretty formative, pretty regular. It's the introduction that I want to have, that this is the first of a 2-part series about A and B, and today we'll discuss category A.
That's kind of similar to what you would do, right, Ursula? Yeah. Any other questions? See, we're at 4:30.
Yeah, I see Ahmad's question here, which I guess we just responded to.
Yeah.
And somebody asked.
Thanks, Ahmad.
No, somebody else asked. Do I think 30 minutes is the best? No, I think the best is what the interviewer feels comfortable with, and finds that that it has merit standing alone.
Right. These days you can do 30 minutes or you can do 5 hours if you're Joe Rogan.
Yeah, it's like forget the name. That's part of the problem. Fresh Air, Terry Gross will have longer and more frequent. We'll take a moment now and reintroduce our guest, who's talked about whether they're 15 seconds or 60 seconds, and that helps frame down the time of the actual interview and fills what I believe is a 50-minute program for her.
I'm not sure. What are you saying? If you
have more breaks in the program, so you use time with re-interviewing or play a tune, or have someone come in. Sometimes if it's a short interview, she has people who regularly talk about a certain issue of which they're knowledgeable.
So her interview length varies. I didn't even notice that, I guess. It changes.
Yeah, it takes, you got to listen a little bit, but it's always on at the same time, and it's concluded a few minutes of the hour. But within it, there are these second fillers, or maybe 10-second fillers, or whatever it is. I sometimes do that if it's a 25-minute interview. I'll play the theme song at the end of the interview twice. Not fully twice, but I'll find out where the music blends together and replay it, so that rather than it being a 2 minute and 13 second piece, it comes out to be a 3 minute piece.
Yeah, I have found that to be a helpful tool for Sprouts. If that's running a little short, we just do the theme song a little longer and it's fine.
That's right, and the listeners don't really know. And if the theme song is is unique to the program, they like it.
Well, thank you, Barry. It's been a joy having you today. I learned a lot from listening to you, and I think everyone did. And
yeah, I had a good time putting it together for the past several days.
oh, that's great. Well, it's been wonderful, and it was really nice to have a nice big group today. And of course, we'll be on YouTube, the YouTubes too. So there'll be more people who get to listen to you also. And if you can remember to send me those bullet points, Barry, I'll get those out. I wrote down everyone's email that I saw. Once anyone wants to stick around for the yurt tour, I'm gonna do it. So otherwise, everyone have a wonderful day and thank you so much.
Thank you, Barry.
Okay, well, thank you all. Thanks, Ursula. Nice to see you. Nice to see you from WPVM. Where is that?
Oh, you're muted, Davey.
In Asheville, North Carolina.
All right. Well, thanks for listening.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.